Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever and whenever you are. I am Rune from Rune'sGuild, and this is another episode of RPG Horror Stories. I think I'll have time in this one to go through two stories, so hopefully we can see those. Up first, we have a story about somebody who was taught the importance of Session 0. And now, of course, I'm inclined to believe Session Zeros are very important, but maybe this person didn't think so beforehand and then absolutely got their game wrecked. So, before we get into even longer of an introduction, let's go ahead and roll the first post. This story happened about 2 years ago, in the days of in-person games. I had gotten my hands on a shiny new third-party D&D 5e module, Odyssey of the Dragon Lords. Being a huge fan of Greek myths, dragons, and the inheritance cycle, I was looking forward to running this for my close friends. Spoilers for the module, so if you intend on playing this module, I recommend you don't read further. That is from me as well as Rune. Please don't listen anymore if you don't want anything spoiled. Of course, this is a few years ago, so if you haven't played it yet and you don't want to get spoiled, go play it, I guess. Anyways, back to the story. I gathered my party, Divum, a nymph bard played by my sister who rarely plays TTRPGs, Alberic, a dwarven fighter played by a college friend who I had run through a Pathfinder 1st edition campaign that got converted to D&D 5e much later. This campaign was very homebrew, very anime, and honestly stats meant little. Gaia, a siren bard played by my wife. We met during 5e D&D with other friends, and this is the only edition she touched at the time. Clang, Warforged Barbarian, played by my old man, who had mostly played war games in the 80s, but just like the RP in modern D&D, had never played 5e before. Chickenbone, a goblin rogue played by my younger brother, had never played TTRPGs before this, and finally, our lesson in the guise of a PC, Jix, Satyr Warlock, played by a friend that I've known since my high school days. The module puts a heavy focus on players feeling invested in the characters they make in several ways. The themes of the story revolve around the party each being heroes to participate in a prophecy that ends with them slaying two titans, ancient godlike beings native to the continent plane of Thalia, where the campaign takes place. During character creation, players select an epic path, a background hook that decides the main objectives of the campaign, as well as grants boons upon the completion of the quests included. And unknown to the players gives each PC a minimum of one get-out-of-jail-free card in case of character death. And finally, right off the bat, NPCs are meant to see the PCs as heroes even if the campaign begins at level 1. These are all things I unfortunately didn't explain in depth in a Session 0, as the title of the post suggests. So, as you'll soon see, players came in with a very different expectations of what kind of game was coming, at least when compared to Jix. You see, Jix was and has always been a power gamer above a role player. He'd deny it, sure, but whenever I would play with Jix's usual group, I would always feel off because that group focused on stats above my preferred casual RP with the flow style. This meant that Jix had a very different approach than the rest of the table, but assumed he did not. This clearly isn't the best situation, so I'll stop setting the scene and get onto the actual event that made me go, oh man, I'm never running anything without a Session 0. The event in question happens in Session 1, yep, that quick. The PCs all meet in an inn summoned by an envoy of Thalia's oracle to be tested. The envoy, Kyra, not so secretly a god in disguise, was told to test them to see if they had the metal necessary to take on the Titans way down the line. This was to be done by hunting a giant boar that was terrorizing the countryside. The players get a bit of RP, some info gathering, a long rest, and are sent off. Once the party is led to the Great Boar's Cave, they are met with a CR3 beast that can easily down one of them in a single hit, but is secretly gaining exhaustion points every round. The encounter is designed to be hard, and with any other group it would have been. With Jix though, Jix made it impossible. Warning, mild mental illness references made from here. Jix's player had told me as we started that this character would receive communications from the voices in his head. He chuckled and told me that this was actually one of our mutual friends on the other end of a messenger chat that would tell him to do things, and Jix would act upon this. So, when the voices told Jix to kill the other players, well, Jix didn't hesitate. Casting Sleep on the party members closest to the boar, who wasn't even a round into combat yet, he succeeded in putting Alberic to sleep. This meant one of the two tanks was immediately out of commission. The second, Clang went down fast. Even though his rage helped him somewhat, the boar took out the rest of the party, except for Jix, rapidly eventually leading to 3 failed death saves for both Alberic and, if memory serves, Gaia. The boar eventually died of exhaustion and divine Kyra intervention, and the party all glared at Jix, especially Alberic's player, who I've learned gets quite emotionally attached to his PC avatars. Jix laughed it off, and the tension dissipated a bit when Kyra pulled out 2 true res scrolls from her satchel. She was officially only supposed to have 1, but sometimes you want to make the players happy. Good point. After this, the party was naturally distrusted of Jix, which seemed to affect his playstyle somewhat, and he eventually, 2 sessions later, decided to let himself get killed by harpies in a random encounter in order to change character. Despite my explaining that this was not a necessity, Jix believed Jix was the problem, and could save the party with another character. Unfortunately, a certain ongoing worldwide event soon began after Session 3, and we were forced to drop the campaign altogether. I realized after the catastrophe that was the boar encounter that a Session 0 would have allowed me to set PvP boundaries, campaign expectations, and all sorts of useful rules and safety nets to get ahead of this exact kind of event. I've been running 2 campaigns since, both with a mandatory Session 0, and one of which being my 4th and most successful so far attempt at this particular module. Both Alberic and Gaia's players are present and enjoying the campaign, sans PvP and all co-op. My current campaigns follow the same general guidelines outlined in Session 0. Tool consent PvP at any time, contact me directly and in private if you feel you need to stop the scene for any reason whatsoever, roleplay emphasis and a heads up regarding the challenge of the campaign, and a list of things players want and don't want in the campaign, liable to be modified at any time. Session 0s have allowed me to easily give a world primer for the campaign, making it much easier to brief players upon the setting itself, which is great. I also want to specify I don't believe Jix was the bad guy here, as his style of play was simply incompatible with everyone else's. This isn't a crime in and of itself, and once I spoke to Jix about it, it made it much easier for us to simply not feel bad about not being invited to each other's tables. I've never had a player go, "This campaign isn't for me, actually," but that's something a Session 0 allows for. Moral of the story, don't be past me, do a Session 0. There's 0 negatives and a million positives. Edit. I do agree with you all that I should have nipped this in the bud, owing to my knowledge of how this would affect particularly new players. I've learned power word no since, and consider myself a significantly better DM than I was before. This is part of why I didn't believe Jix was the problem. I never saw the issues as it happened, and my philosophy had been, the players have more fun if they have more freedom. That's the point of this story to me. This dramatically changed the way I run games for the better from what I can tell. Thanks to the comments confirming my thoughts, I didn't want to immediately peg Jix as a butthole, but this wasn't meant to be an Am I the Asshole post, as it is an event of the past, and I'm no longer playing with Jix. Okay, so I mean that's pretty good right out the start. Not much of a horror story, more of a learning experience. It's good that the DM learned no. I know back when I started playing, I would never say no to any of my players, and it ended up, I had this entire campaign planned, because it was going to be like our last hurrah before I went off to school, because I wasn't going to be able to play with them after that. So had this whole campaign planned. It was going to be maybe like a three-shot campaign. So it was going to take place in a city. They were going to get a boat and get a quest to go to an island. On the island, they were going to run into a bunch of like meme references, you know, like Preston Garvey and Shrek were going to be there. Then they were going to travel and then eventually kill like a vampire queen or something like that. I don't really remember. But I didn't know how to say no. So they ended up stealing a different boat than the one they were supposed to be given by the city after attacking a bunch of citizens in the city. And then they sailed beyond that into the unknown waters, and I had to like redo an entire campaign, and then it fell to pieces because of that. But like power word no is a very powerful skill a DM has, you know. Of course, if your players are completely fine with anything that could happen, there's no reason to necessarily use that. But I guess that's what the point of the story is, right? A good Session 0 lays down expectations and lets people know what's going to be happening and if things are going to be allowed and what isn't going to be allowed. I always do Session 0s now, solely for the fact that Some of my players that I currently have difficulty making their characters like each other. So we do session zeros now solely for the fact that when we make characters during it, I force them to make each other in their background and their history somehow, or have some tie-in that makes them care about each other, because I ran so many campaigns where these players would make characters that did not like each other at all. And it's like, why is the party together if you guys are constantly at each other? So we could be talking like, it could be like a year into the campaign and they still would not like the other ones. And I decided to put that to rest. That's really all I have to say on this one. Go to the DM, go to the players. Nobody's really like in the wrong here. It's more like some people just needed to have different expectations spoken to them before doing anything. That's really all there is to this one. And we will move on now to the next one, which has a very brief title, so I'm not entirely sure what it's completely about, but it just says RPG Horror on the Netherlands Trip. So, before we get into a longer introduction of the second one and an even longer what do you say when you're talking about the end thing? Before we, you know what, let's just finish the other story and get started on this post. And I didn't say it, so I gotta say it now. Let's roll the post. This tale is about a D&D 5e mini campaign I organized and DM'd during a 2-week vacation that I and some of my internet friends were spending in the Netherlands. We were pretty happy with the campaign in the end, but there were 2 moments where the campaign's future was hanging in the balance. Prior to the trip, I spent an inordinate amount of time and money prepping. I made paper minis for the characters, enemies, and NPCs, all of which I'd taken time to draw digitally beforehand. This amounted to dozens of drawings to provide a decent variety of opponents. I bought map books and dry erase markers and laminated maps for 2 separate multi-layered boats. I also gave blanket permission for everyone going on the trip to participate and had 10 players on board. Now, some RPG veterans might point to this issue as the first sign that things are going to go haywire, but the 10 players weren't really an issue. I'd carefully split them into 2 parties racing to complete the same objective, planning to merge them once the campaign was drawing to a close. When several players would drop out on account of not staying the full 2 weeks, also it was only 2 weeks of occasional sessions, I figured I could herd that many cats for a fortnight. The campaign started off under a bad omen. One of the players was joining a day later than the others. A few people went to pick up said player, while I and several others set up the game in anticipation of them heading back as quickly as possible to the start of the session. But there was a miscommunication, and while those of us back at the house we rented were under the impression that the others would pick up the late player, head back immediately, the welcome crew was not. Part of us was sitting back at the house growing more and more frustrated as the others were sending back pictures of themselves eating dinner and goofing around in Amsterdam. I was particularly annoyed given how much I'd invested in the campaign. There was a bit of yelling and defensiveness that night. After a frank discussion the next morning, we moved past our grievances and started the campaign properly. First disaster averted. Minor hijinks that ensued. While having their characters buy equipment prior to the trip to the Netherlands, the players discovered the price list for animals and each party proceeded to buy themselves at least 1 pet, forcing me to scramble to create assets for those too. Fortunately, I could convince one party to get a donkey, for which I had art already. The other bought a cat and a mule. I drew the cat and solved the problem with the mule by having the captain of the boat they were taking flat out refuse to take it on board. Several of us had spent money on dice trackers. Being clever, we had one person that would visit from the US, order them, and bring them back to the meetup. They caught COVID and canceled their trip and left our dice trackers stranded in the US. Because I'd split the players into parties, there were an equal number of observers available for every session. This became a bit of a problem when players and audience were talking to each other instead of paying attention, but this smoothed out as the campaign went along. The location of the campaign was going to take place in a cursed city. One feature of this city was that the birds were unnaturally aggressive and attacked humanoids on sight, which the players knew about from witness accounts. What they did not know was that this extended to any animals that encountered the city limits. The party with the donkey solved this by not bringing him into the city, and the other party, the mug, constantly threatened to kill their cat to the protests and annoyance of every other member. The cat ultimately survived after being stuffed in a bag and getting knocked out every time it woke up. Oh no! The mule probably would have died had it not stayed in port. One player bites off more than they can chew of edibles. I end up having to deal with a very loopy player on top of hurting a group to pay attention to the game. One player that left after the first week was replaced by another person that showed up later, and the chipper, Pollyanna Optimist Gnome, turned into a jaded doomer for a few sessions. One of the players forgot their dice at the house after they left for home. Someone else heroically brought them to the absent player at the airport, who promptly forgot them on the plane home. Oof. I managed to get a handle on all these hiccups, and the players are starting to pay attention, getting invested in the puzzles and fights I throw at them. Then the second disaster strikes. I start sneezing uncontrollably and my nose starts running. I write this off as allergies which had flared up and subsided before the trip, but take a COVID test just to be sure. Unlike the test I took while it was only allergies, this one turns positive immediately and remains so for the time interval. The result is meant to be red. The campaign and my vacation are both in jeopardy. The group came to the decision to take a calculated risk and keep me on board, but isolating and keeping my distance from everyone else. Only 2 others ended up being infected as well, though hilariously not the person I'd been sharing a room with for the first week. Part of this was because we all wanted to finish that campaign, which was also the only activity I was still able to participate in. COVID itself was only a minor annoyance to me. I was fully vaccinated and boosted, and the symptoms were milder than some of the colds I've had. Dealing with the Dutch health services in isolation was the bigger headache. We salvaged the campaign with one of the Dutch participants getting a plexiglass screen from their parents and me relying on those players to move the pieces as I was cordoned off behind a screen. My DM screen and a mask. I end up having to rush the ending though, since one of the other players is showing symptoms and wants to drive home before getting knocked out cold. That player ends up landing the killing blow on the boss too, but rushes to leave before they can claim the boss's printed out paper mini as their prize. So, despite the rough start and me, the DM, succumbing to disease, we managed to salvage the campaign and bring out to a satisfying conclusion. Joel didn't read, the vacation campaign with 10 players is off to a bad start and proves and is derailed when the DM fails to save versus disease. The group rallies and saves the campaign. So that's that story. I think it's pretty entertaining. Good on the DM for staying so optimistic and continuing it up. I know some people, if they had even a few annoyances, they would just scrap the whole thing, blame the entire party, and then just be like, okay, we're done playing, bye, goodbye. But good on the DM for being very optimistic and willing to work with the party, and even if you have a loopy edible eater player, good job, I suppose, for being very knowing how to work with your players, and good job on not giving everybody COVID. The only thing that I thought about this story that was kind of interesting, more interesting. The story itself is interesting, don't get me wrong, but the only thing that I thought was a little bit more interesting was the player forgetting his dice on the plane, and I feel so bad for him. I feel so bad, especially the one who drove the dice out to him. Could you imagine you go through all that trouble to get somebody their dice back, and then that person just forgets them anyways? And how do you forget your dice on the plane? Shouldn't you just put them in a bag? Do you just take them out and play with them? Maybe they just weren't important dice to him. I don't know. Maybe it's a good thing, because everybody in the house, well, not everybody, 2 people got COVID, but there's probably COVID on the dice, so, who knows. And that poor cat getting knocked out, just so you don't get killed, but you wake up knocked out again, wake up knocked out again. How much HP do cats have in 5e? What, one hit point in 5e? So how are they knocking the cat out? Maybe they were just casting sleep on it, I don't know. As somebody who has 14 cats, it's a little funny to me, because sometimes I wonder, I wish I could cast sleep on my cats. No, I mean, that's really all I have to say about this story. I thought it was pretty cool. It's nice to see people successfully lead 10 players and not get frustrated and end campaigns immediately. I myself have ended a few campaigns prematurely just because I was annoyed at something the players were doing. But I've matured since then, and as the first story said, I've learned power word no. So when things aren't going exactly how they should, I just say, no, you're not doing that, and then we continue. It's only a railroad if it's the entire thing, right? So as long as you have reason to do something, it's probably not too bad. But before I keep talking even longer, I should probably go ahead and just do my whole outro thing. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did not enjoy, I am sorry. I will try to do better in another video. Stick around. I'm sure there'll be something you enjoy. And if you don't find anything you enjoy ever, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry. I'll give up. I'm not giving up. I'm gonna stick around. So if you enjoyed, leave a like, leave a comment, leave a subscription. If you have your own horror stories, put them in the comments below. If you don't, good job. And if you have a horror story and you want to see it in our upcoming 100 sub celebration, which is going to be a huge multi-hour-long compilation of subscriber horror stories, go ahead and send it to my email. It's in the channel description, or post the whole thing in the comments, and I'll read it from there. If you can't think of anything to comment, just comment power word no for me. On top of that, thank you so much for all the support again, and I hope you enjoyed. That's all I have to say. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.